All right, well, good afternoon, Rocky Hill small group facilitators. Christopher Scott here, recording this at 4 p.m. on Monday, July 20th, if you're watching it live or catching it later on YouTube or somewhere else there. So today we're going to start a little series going through prophecy. So we're going to talk about Daniel this week today, and then Revelation next week, because one of our small groups is going to be starting a verse-by-verse study through the book of Revelation, I think in probably August or September. It's one of our groups that have covered the whole Bible since they have been together, the two facilitators that I work with. So I'm going to make some of these videos to help that facilitator and his wife, those two folks, to take their group through Revelation, okay? But first, when you talk about Revelation, it's good to take a brief look at Daniel. So let's talk about Daniel first, and then I'm going to give you your small group training tip for the week as well at the very end. So there are 66 books in the Bible, okay? 66 books in the Bible. There's 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. Out of those 39 in the Old Testament, there's 5 books of Moses, the law, the Torah, 5 books of law. There's 12 books of history. There's 5 major prophets, 12 minor prophets, and then there's 5 books of wisdom there in the middle. And so out of the 5 major prophets, those are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Okay, 5 what we call major prophets, and then there's 12 minor prophets. Why major? Why minor? Well, they are longer, right? The 5 major prophets are longer, with the exception of Lamentations, which is only 5 chapters, right? But that gets lumped in with Jeremiah because Jeremiah likely wrote Lamentations, okay? So there's 5 major prophets, and Daniel is the 5th of those 5 major prophets. And so as we talk about this book, it's good to have a little historical background. And I've covered this in some other videos, but if you can get these few basic details down, these few basic dates down, anytime you read the Bible or the prophets, it will really make sense for you and give you some context to what's going on and where, okay? So the nation of Israel was this big old, huge, strong nation under David and Solomon, but under Solomon's son Rehoboam, he has a meeting between the Israelite tribes in the north. Their headquarters was Samaria, the Israelites in the north, and then Judah in the south. Their headquarters was Jerusalem. They have this meeting. The 10 tribes in the north get mad at Rehoboam, and they split and take off. So the nation was divided. We often call that the divided kingdom. But under David and Solomon, it was the united kingdom. And then starting with Rehoboam, 921 BC, that kingdom splits, okay? There's Israel in the north, and the capital city of Israel in the north is Samaria. And then there's Judah in the south. There's 2 tribes there, Judah and Benjamin. Those 2 tribes, the nation of Judah with Jerusalem as the capital. So that split happens about 921 BC. And then in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes from the east and they conquer Israel, all 10 tribes, in 722 BC. And they take those Israelites back to Assyria. But over time, the Assyrians get conquered by these people called the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians come to Judah 3 different times, to the city of Jerusalem in Judah. So Judah is the country, Jerusalem is the city. The Babylonians come 3 different times and conquer the people living in the nation of Judah and the people living in the city of Jerusalem, okay? They come in 605, 597, and 586 BC. 605 BC, 597 BC, 586 BC, okay? And you can read about that actually in the book of Jeremiah. He tells the story of all this going on, and you can read as well in 2 Kings as well about that happening. And so Daniel is part of that 605 conquering by the Babylonians. The Babylonians come, they grab Daniel, and they take him back, right? So Assyria conquers Israel, and let's back up a little bit. There's the United Kingdom under David and Solomon. Then Rehoboam in 921 splits the kingdom. There's 10 tribes in the north in Israel. 2 tribes in the south, which is Judah. Samaria is the capital city in the north of Israel. And when you read in the Bible, it talks about Samaria and Israel, and it gets confusing whether they're talking about the country or the city. And the same thing with Jerusalem and Judah. So that's why I differentiate those. So Samaria was the capital city in Israel in the north, the 10 tribes. And then Judah had Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital city of Judah in the south, 2 tribes. Okay, that happened in 921 when they split. In 722 BC, Assyria comes to Israel in the north, and they conquer the Israelites and those 10 tribes, and they take them back to Assyria, and they pretty much disappear. Then, over time, this nation called Babylon conquers Assyria, and then Babylon comes to the nation of Judah in 605 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC, and they decimate Judah in 586 BC, and they pretty much level the city of Jerusalem. And then a little time goes on, and the Babylonians, who now rule Israel and Judah, they get conquered by these people named the Persians. And there's this Persian king that decides he wants to let the Jews go back to their city of Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. That's what happens in the book of Ezra. And then to rebuild their walls around the city. That's what happens in the book Nehemiah, okay? In 444 BC, roughly in there. So that gives you a big old broad stroke of the Old Testament and where these prophets fit in. And Daniel slides in there in that 605 BC when Babylon comes to Judah for the first time and conquers them and takes Daniel back to Babylon, right? And teaches him there what it means to be, they recognize Daniel as this guy that has, knowledge and wisdom, and he's young and intelligent and has potential. And he was taken back in 605. So that's a little background to the book of Daniel that helps you make sense. And we talk about the book of Daniel because it talks about a lot of prophecy relating to the book of Revelation. The first half of the book is history of what has happened. Then the last half of the book really is prophecy, talking about what's going to happen in the future, specifically to the Gentile nations. And there's a lot of details in there and difficult parts, but a few things to make sure we cover. Number one, the Antichrist that will rise up in the future is described in the book of Daniel in chapter 7, verses 24 through 25. Chapter 9, verse 27. Chapter 11, verse 36 through 45 talks about the Antichrist. Jesus also is talked about in his return in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. In my opinion, not everybody would see that. And then there's these 70 weeks of years that are talked about in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. I'm giving you these verses because you're going to need to do a little study on your own if you're going to facilitate a small group and understand what they mean. So there's these 70 weeks of years, right? So a week was often talked about as a year in their time, and there's historical background to that. And so what has happened is basically there is 1 week left of those 70 weeks of years, and each week was a 7-year period in how it's described in the book of Daniel, okay? So each week is a 7-year period, and we are between that 49th and 50th week, waiting for the 7 years of tribulation to begin, which is described in the book of Revelation and the epistles of Thessalonians, okay? So I'm just giving you a brief taste here. One of the reasons I like to give you good commentaries and resources is so you can study on your own and get a little game plan of how you facilitate the group and then take it from there, okay? So that's the 70 weeks of 7 years, okay? And then also time, times, and half a time is talked about in the book of Revelation, or in the book of Daniel, as well as in the book of Revelation, as that was a way of describing a 7-year period. So I have it marked in my Bible here. Where is it at? Maybe farther. It's in the prophecy section, obviously, starting in chapter 7. 7 through 12 seems to be mostly prophecy of the future, in my opinion. Chapter 7, verse 25. A time, times, and half a time. A time, times, and half a time. Okay? Then chapter 12, verse 7, a time, times, and half a time. And that phrase is also used in the book of Revelation. It'll talk about a time, times, and half a time. It'll talk about 3.5 years, 1,360 days, in different ways that seem to indicate the two halves of the tribulation and the 7-year period. Okay, so that's the book of Daniel, shotgun style, a ton of information. That's half a seminary class I just summarized for you. So I hope that's helpful for you, but not overwhelming. And I'm going to refer to Daniel as we do a little bit of studies in Revelation. So what I'm going to do the next few weeks is give broad overviews of how people understand the book of Revelation, because for you, the facilitator taking your group through that book, when people talk about the book of Revelation, the symbols, how they interpret those symbols is based on their view of interpretation of the book of Revelation. And there's 4 different broad categories of how people interpret it, and that will make your life a lot easier when you facilitate that discussion, because you can say, well, that's this view, that's this view, and people take this view of why, and I say, well, that's not my view. Well, that's, how, if you're going to take it that way, that's in this camp, and then they'll realize, no, that's not really what I believe. So, all right, the book of Daniel. Lastly, before we go, I've been sharing with you some of these tips from Karen Lee-Thorp, how to ask great questions, okay? Tip number 5, she says, say what you mean. Say what you mean, okay? It's easier to say what you mean when you keep a question simple. Still, it's often a good idea to go back over a list of questions and ask yourself, is this what I mean to ask? And she's writing this for people that develop their own questions as part of their small group. This is an example. A question, what does it mean to the way we live that human beings are members of the family of God? Karen says, that's not a terrible question, but maybe what I really want to ask is, how do you think being members of God's family should affect the way we live? See, that's a little bit shorter and a little bit more direct. That seems clear. What does Pilate say when Jesus starts talking about truth? Is another example. What does Pilate say when Jesus starts talking about truth? It's okay to ask someone to quote the text before I ask them what the statement means, but perhaps it will be more economical for me to observe what Pilate says and ask the group what he means, okay? Example, when Pilate says, what is truth? What do you think he's asking Jesus? How would you put this question in your own words? She says, I'm always on the lookout for vagueness. Here's another example. How do you respond to what Jesus says in Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20? This question, according to her, is likely to leave people wondering what kind of response I'm asking about. An emotional response, an opinion about the truth or falsehood of Jesus' statement, a personal application, I should specify. This is an example. What feelings does Jesus' statement in Matthew 5, 17 through 20 evoke in you? Or, in what ways is this paragraph relevant to silence? In what ways is this paragraph relevant to us since we do not live under the Jewish law? So, a lot of times we have to think people can't see what we're reading if you're writing your own questions, and you got to be direct and say what you mean. Great book. If you would like a copy, I think I have a couple extra. I would love to give you if you would like to read this. So, thanks again for watching. I'll start next week, Lord willing. We'll talk about the book of Revelation a little bit for one of our groups that is going through Revelation as a training resource to help him and her that are taking their group through there, and hopefully some good discipleship, helps for you as someone that walks people through the Bible and as helping them learn and grow in God's Word. So thanks again for watching. Catch you again on another video.